There's no longer the faith in what we hear from pharmaceutical companies and others on the efficacy of drugs over the years. These follow the various scandals that have taken place. More people killed in America in the 80s from an arrhythmic drug than were killed in the Vietnam War. We've recently had Vioxx, which killed 140,000 people with heart attacks and strokes in America, and wouldn't have been discovered here by our own system. It only was spotted in America as a side effect. We've had Seroxat in this House. I'm an old lag of the Seroxat debate, where the drug companies persistently lied to their customers, and we've seen the massive fines that have taken place in America and elsewhere about drug companies, and it's right that we question the efficacy of the drugs and the advice that's given. And what's prompted today's meeting, of course, is this almost exact correlation between rising mental health disabilities and rising psychiatric drug prescriptions. And this has been observed in many countries with very different health services, including Australia, Iceland, the United States, New Zealand, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. And it's particularly important that we look to this because there is also evidence in many trials that long-term use of psychiatric drugs, particularly antidepressants, result in long-term health problems, and the outcomes become worse. I mean, I speak as a child of the war, where we lived under extraordinary conditions of dirt, poverty, and immediate danger, where there was no such thing as depression as an illness. But we have, in recent years, become conditioned to believe that our lot as human beings, we should breeze through life from cradle to grave with a beatific smile on our faces, somehow avoiding all the inevitable problems of grief and sadness that affect our lives. And that it appears that there hasn't been a great success to try to smother those problems with a blanket of chemical drugs. The idea of the meeting is that we should reach, at the end of it, some kind of consensus on the way forward. We've got very distinguished speakers who will outline the problem to us, and we're hoping that by the end of this session we should find ourselves in a position to be far better informed and with a clear idea of practical solutions to reduce what seems to be a great amount of harm being done by drugs. We've got, I mean, you hear the figures, but we know in this country that in the last 25 years the use of antidepressants has increased by 500%. We've seen the large, similar increase in the number of people taking time off work for these diseases. And there doesn't seem to be any apparent explanation for this. We haven't become a sadder society. We've become an immensely more wealthy society and should be a satisfied society in any way. So we want to address these practical problems. I've been asked to say that the session is being filmed. If anyone objects to being filmed, if they'd like to sit at the back or put a bag over their head, I mean, it's up to them to do that. But if you are shy about being filmed, please let us know. The other point is that to welcome you here. This is a marvellous building. You will hear bells go off occasionally, and they're not fire alarms. They're bells to say that the House of Commons is at prayer, which is, depending how many people get to prayer, we can measure the stage of depression in the country and anxiety on various things. I imagine the affair number this morning, and bells will ring at other points, but don't be alarmed about that. I've got the great pleasure of introducing Mr. Robert Whitaker, who's got a knock-em-dead CV. I'll briefly mention that he was a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Director of Publications at Harvard Medical School, co-founded CenterWatch, a publishing company that covered the pharmaceutical clinical trials industry, and in 2001 he wrote his first book, Mad in America, about psychiatric research and medication. And 1998 Boston Globe article series he co-wrote on psychiatric research and it was a finalist for the 1999 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. And his 2010 book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, was awarded the best investigative journalist book in America. Mr. Robert Whitaker. Robert.
Well, thank you very much. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. I have 30 minutes, so I'm going to really move through this data pretty quickly, okay? And here's I've been really asked to make an argument, and the argument is this. I believe that the increasing use of antidepressants and actually other psychiatric drugs are driving the disability numbers. Now, we'll see the correlation number, but I think there's plenty of scientific evidence as well showing that why the drugs themselves would be stirring this increase in disability. And going through the arguments, you can see the correlative data. Remember, these drugs are meant to be causative agents. They're meant to change how you experience depression or whatever the other symptom is over the long period of time. Focusing on antidepressants, you'll see in the research literature a rather robust body of literature showing that they increase the chronicity of the disorder over the long term. You will see that they increase the likelihood that a unipolar patient will convert to bipolar disorder, which is a more severe illness. And then you'll see as far as benzodiazepines, long-term use of benzodiazepines are associated or correlated, you'll see, with impaired functioning. And even with schizophrenia, it looks like antipsychotics worsen functional outcomes over the long term. In the aggregate, I will emphasize these are aggregate outcomes. It does not mean that nobody does well on the medications, that sort of thing. It just means in the aggregate, are we causing these sort of worsening long-term outcomes? The correlative data and really focusing what's driving the disability numbers in country after country is in fact the mood disorders, the affective disorders. It's depression and anxiety that's driving the disability numbers. In the United States in 1994, we had about 400,000 people on disability due to depression, anxiety. We're now at about 2.1 million people in 2013. And you'll see the use of antidepressants in that time went from 2% of the population to 8%. Just correlative data, okay? Here's in the United Kingdom, this is Joanna Moncrieff's data. You'll see the same thing, this rather remarkable rise in the number of people on disability in the last 16 years, and during the same time, this increase in antidepressants usage, just correlated data. Australia, they've had a 4-fold increase in the number of people on disability due to mental illness in the last 20 years. And you'll see their use of antidepressants went from around 1% of the population to 9%. This is a little bit different types of data. This is the number of people going on disability due to mental illness in Denmark each year. You've seen that from 2000 to 2010, the number roughly doubled. And again, you see the increase in the use of antidepressants. Iceland, this is the same type of data. It's the number of new cases of disability each year. And you'll see it's over a doubling of new cases of people going on disability due to mental illness, increase in antidepressants. Then this is if you look at all the disability cases in Sweden each year, what is the percentage due to mental illness? You go back to 2000, it was roughly 25% of new cases were due to mental illness, and now we're at 60% in Sweden. So what you see in country after country is this correlation. Rising disability rates due to affective disorders, that's anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder. At the same time, we see this rising use of antidepressants. It's just correlative data, okay? But that correlative data does obviously raise a question, and the question is, could the antidepressants themselves and other psychiatric drugs, could they in some way be fueling this disability, this rising disability, okay? Now, real quickly, these are meant to be causative agents. They're meant to change depression over the long term or bipolar over the long term, etc. Now, we have an understanding, the general understanding is that somehow these are normalizing agents. We got the story that antidepressants fix chemical imbalances in the brain. In fact, that hypothesis, a valid hypothesis, that say depression was due to low serotonin, never panned out. They did not find, for example, that depression, as a matter of course, was due to low serotonin, and that drugs that upped serotonergic activity therefore fixed it, like insulin for diabetes. So basically, the biological causes of depression and these other disorders remain unknown. And once you understand that, you have to ask, what do the drugs do? How do they affect the brain? And what you really find is that they're abnormalizing agents. Now, this is a paper by Stephen Hyman He's the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health. And he said, here is a paradigm for understanding how psychotropic drugs work. They perturb some normal neurotransmitter functions. So, for example, an antidepressant. How do neurons communicate? You have a presynaptic neuron that releases that molecule into the tiny gap between neurons. That molecule, serotonin, binds with receptors on the receiving neuron. We say it fits like a lock into a key. Okay, that's how messages get passed. Then you have to remove that serotonin from that tiny gap between neurons. And one of the ways you remove it, that serotonin goes back up into the presynaptic neuron. What does an SSRI do? It blocks that removal process. Serotonin now stays longer in the synaptic cleft than normal. That's how you up serotonergic activity. But the brain, being this extraordinarily neuroplastic organ, will now try to maintain normal functioning of the serotonergic system. Researchers will say it tries to maintain a homeostatic equilibrium, and what it will do is it will now dial down its serotonergic machinery. The presynaptic neurons will put out less serotonin than normal for a period of time. That compensatory adaptation may break down after time. And then the receiving neurons will actually downregulate, decrease their density of receptors for serotonin. So this is what you see here. The chronic administration of the drugs then cause substantial, long-lasting alterations in neural functioning. After a few weeks, the person's brain is now functioning in the manner it is, and this is from our former director of the NIMH, is qualitatively as well as quantitatively different from the normal state. Now again, this does not prove anything about the long-term effects of the drugs. It's just a different conception. Rather than normalizing some known abnormality, some pathology, in fact, they're creating an abnormality in the brain. And the irony is, in essence, because of this drug-induced oppositional intolerance, they're creating the very abnormality hypothesized to cause the problem in the first place. And you're going to see as we go through this, researchers returning to this problem to sort of explain what's going on with long-term effects of these drugs. Now, in order to assess whether a drug or treatment is providing a long-term benefit, you have to understand what is the natural course for that disease, that disorder, and your intervention has to improve on that natural course, because in nature there is often a capacity to recover from depression or other psychiatric problems. So your intervention has to improve on that, otherwise you're going to, on the whole, worsen outcomes. Does that make sense? Many people can do well, but you have to improve on that natural capacity. So if you look at the studies about the long-term course of depression in the pre-antidepressant era, and by the way, these are studies in hospitalized patients. We heard in the beginning, we didn't used to hear about depression in the general population. When you studied depression, you were studying hospitalized cohorts. You followed them for, these were really depressed patients. You followed them for long-term, and here's what you find. First of all, 80 to 85% would be discharged within a year. And then if you follow these patients long-term, about 50% would never have a bout serious enough to be re-hospitalized. There'd be about 30% which would have sort of an episodic illness. In other words, they would recover to euthymia, an absence of illness, and then maybe 2-3 years later they'd have another episode. And then there was about 15 to 20% who became chronically depressed. Now, George Whitaker, this was a group at Washington University that in the 60s tried to flesh out the long-term outcomes of different psychiatric disorders, and here's what they said about depression. It will not tend towards a more chronic course. It's an episodic disorder. That was our understanding at the start of the antidepressant era, okay? And very quickly, it's going to begin to change our understanding about the long-term course. So the next thing I did when I was looking at this was try to find out clinicians at the time who had seen the natural sort of recovery from depression. Now they're giving medication. Do they notice that change in the clinical course of their patients? And they do. You start hearing people say, yeah, my patients are getting better faster, but now they're relapsing back into depression more frequently than they used to. And you'll see this. It's causing a quantification. Now this is a clinical perception, okay, that arises with the introduction of the drugs. Then we have a Dutch psychiatrist that says, let me see if that's true. He does a study. He has one study that's unmedicated, one group that's medicated, and he notices that the medicated group, in fact, is relapsing more frequently now, and the time between episodes is becoming shorter. And you'll see here, at the very beginning of the antidepressant era, he says, should this increase be regarded as an untoward long-term side effect of treatment with antidepressants? So you see, early on in the course of this story, this worry arises. The drugs that may be effective over the short term, are they worsening the long-term course? Now, in 1985, the NIMH convened a panel on mood disorders, and they said, what is the natural course? What is the course of depression? And they said, we used to think it was episodic, but we have new studies that are showing it's chronic. Now, they have two things to decide here. Have they made an advance in understanding the natural course of depression, or are they seeing the course of medicated depression? And what they say is, our science is getting better. We used to think it was episodic, but now we have better modern studies showing it runs a chronic course. My point is, you can see in this panel an official recognition that they now seeing depression run a chronic course. Now, this is the largest antidepressant trial ever conducted. It was conducted by the National Institute of Mental Health. It's key to know that this is in real-world patients. If you see industry-funded trials, they have exclusion criteria that actually prevent about 85% of real-world patients from entering those trials. But this was a study that was meant to see what's happening to real-world patients. This study was meant to guide our care in the United States, if you look at it. So what happened? There were 4,000 patients who entered the study, and it was meant to duplicate real-world care conditions. So you would try one antidepressant. If that didn't work, you could get a second. You could go through 4 rounds of care, and the hope was that eventually you would find some type of treatment that worked for you. And you'll see that 1,518 people did remit. That's, I think, roughly 40%. In other words, the depression went away for a period of time. Then the whole point was we need to see if we can keep those people well. So they were whisked into a follow-up trial. They were given the best possible care. People could adjust dosages, that sort of thing. Anyway, at the end of 1 year, there were 108 people, the 4,041 who started the trial, who were still well, who had remitted, stayed well, and hadn't dropped out of the trial. So that's a documented stay well rate of 3%, which is about the worst outcome I've ever seen in a trial. Here's another NIMH study of medicated depression in real-world patients. People come to a clinic, and by the way, these are outpatients. These are not hospitalized patients. They're treated with antidepressants, given best possible care. Only 26% responded to the antidepressants. That means a 50% reduction. But the key is this. At the end of 1 year, only 6% were well. Okay, and you have another 13% are sort of better but not well. So you have about 80% becoming chronically ill in this staying depressed. Here's just his. These findings reveal remarkably low response and remission rates. I'm emphasizing these are studies funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. Okay. Now, Minnesota now publishes an annual report, outcomes report. How are their patients with different diagnoses doing? They come into the year, they have a diagnosis. How are they doing at the end of 1 year? What you see here in real-life care is a lot of chronicity in the depressed patients. You'll see about 5% of those who enter the year with a diagnosis of depression are in remission at the end of the year. About 10% are better. They have a response, that's 50%, and about 85% are not better. So you're seeing about 85% remaining depressed. What I'm showing you here is a lot of data of treated people remaining depressed on the treatment. Now, there was a study done in the late 90s. They said, okay, well, what is the course of unmedicated depression today? And here's what they show. After 1 month, only 23% were better. Not so great, but look what happens. People continue to get better. This actually is the old style of recovery where 85% would be better at the end of 1 year. What did they say? What did these NIMH-funded researchers say? If as many as 85% of depressed individuals who go without somatic treatment spontaneously recover within 1 year, it would be extremely difficult for a treatment to better that. So what I'm just showing you here is differences between medicated outcomes and unmedicated outcomes in this way. So now, given this data, you have an Italian psychologist in 1994 raise the obvious question. These drugs may be helpful over the short term. They may provide a short-term benefit, but maybe they worsen the progression of the disease in the long term by increasing the biochemical vulnerability to depression. He's saying that drugs induce a change in the brain that actually make you more vulnerable to depression over the long term. That's what he's raising the worry here. My point is here, this worry doesn't arise out of nothing. It arises out of looking at this data, okay? By the way, he raises this, and then one of the most famous psychopharmacologists in the United States, Ross Baldessari, said, this is a very uncomfortable thing to consider, but it's time we really looked at this. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to look and see, well, are there other studies today that compare outcomes for unmedicated patients versus medicated patients. Now, they're naturalistic study, they're not randomized, but this is the best I can find. Here's one in the Netherlands. What do you find? If the chronic part is in the 19 and 31%, so about 50% here are going down to sort of a more chronic course. That's the treated group, initially treated with antidepressants. It's 24% for those not treated, so it's sort of a doubling of the chronicity you see there. This is a 5-year study in Canada. They had people keep diaries. You see that the medicated group was depressed about twice as much during the year as the unmedicated group. And you'll see that this researcher said these findings are consistent with that hypothesis that the drugs lead to a deterioration in the long-term treatment of course, mood disorders. This is a really interesting study. It was done by the World Health Organization. They sent investigators into 15 cities around the world. Those investigators identified people coming to a general clinic who had depression, but then didn't say anything, and then they let the general practitioners see if they would diagnose them. The hypothesis was, so they're going to identify people with depression. The hypothesis was those who got diagnosed and treated with antidepressants would have better one-year outcomes. And you'll see that the group that was most likely to be depressed at the end of 1 year was the group that got diagnosed and treated with antidepressants. The group least likely to still be depressed at the end of 1 year was those who got diagnosed with but were not treated with drug. Now here I think we need more data like this. So we have two groups here. Diagnosed, treated with drug, diagnosed, treated without drug. You'll see the severity of symptoms is very close between the two groups at the beginning. You'll see that there's a marked decrease in symptoms in both groups in the 3 months. But what happens after 3 months in the medicated group? They stop getting better, whereas the other group continues to get better. Now, anecdotally, you've all heard of the Prozac poop-out factor. People just claim that drugs stop working after a time. That's what we call it anyway in the United States. That's an illustration, I think, of the poop-out factor. It doesn't continue to work. This was a study that compared antidepressants plus exercise, and exercise alone. The hypothesis was that antidepressants plus exercise would produce the best long-term results. Now, in this particular study, in older individuals, you'll see a lot of improvement, remission at the end of 4 months, 16 weeks. If drug, it's even a little bit better. But look at the end of 10 months. Exercise alone, only 30% were still depressed, and the other groups were over 50%. In other words, the antidepressant, when added to exercise, was an anchor on that. It grew, but it lowered the stay well rate. You see that? So Giovanni Favas comes back after this data and he says, when we prolong treatment over 6-9 months, we may recruit processes that oppose the initial acute effects of antidepressant drugs. That's because he's talking about the drugs driving the brain into a subserotonergic state. That's what he's basically talking about. And he says, when this happens, here's the problem. You tend to become chronic, sort of suffer a low level of depression if you stay on. But if you come off, now you're exposed to a lot of relapses and withdrawal effects too. He's basically talking about a bit of a trap here for many people. So now you see some researchers are putting this hypothesis to the test, that the drugs induce this biological abnormality. This is a study where they looked at people who remitted in trials, either on placebo or on drug. Then they're withdrawn from drug. And then he saw that the relapse rate was twice as high in that remitted category for those who've been drug exposed. And you'll say, what he's saying is here, yeah, this is a biological problem. There's a study from the Netherlands, same sort of thing. They looked at people who remitted in trials, then the stay well rate, and you'll see that the relapse rate is much lower for those who were not on antidepressants. Again, what does he say? Continued treatment may oppose the initial acute effects. Just take time, and I'm going to run out of time here in a second. Read this piece. Rifel Malik was a consultant for Eli Lilly for a long time, expert in mood disorders. Now, he looks at this research literature and he says, I think we have a problem. I think these drugs, over the long term, induce something called tardive dysphoria. Tardive meaning it appears later in the course of treatment. And by the way, when he's talking about dysphoria, I actually think he's describing something a little bit different than depression. So acute depression really hurts. Dysphoria is more an inability to really feel much about the world. So actually, I think a lot of that chronic depression stuff we're seeing in the outcomes literature is a type of dysphoria. And those of you who are therapists know that many people complain long-term on antidepressants. They just can't get excited anymore about things. Anyway, very important, very sort of mainstream researchers say tardive dysphoria manifests as a chronic dysphoric state that is initially relieved by, but ultimately becomes unresponsive to antidepressant medication. What I hope you see here, that first 20 minutes, is that there is a narrative of science that has unfolded over 40 years, beginning in the 1970s, and now you have mainstream people saying, I think we have a problem. These medications induce an abnormality in the brain that leads to this tardive problem. Okay? This is just summing up. The other big risk is that you can see in the history that antidepressants increase the risk that a person with unipolar depression will convert to bipolar. Now that progression was always understood, but it was a low risk. And with the introduction of antidepressants, you start getting case reports of antidepressant-induced mania. Swiss investigators say once we begin using antidepressants, we see many more bipolar patients in our hospitals. You can see in 1993, the APA says all antidepressant treatments may provoke manic episodes. Yale investigators then quantified the risk. They did a big study of people diagnosed with a mood disorder, a non-bipolar mood disorder, anxiety or depression. They looked at those exposed to antidepressants, those not exposed, and for this age group, 15 to 29, they saw that basically the risk of conversion to a bipolar diagnosis was doubled in the group treated with an antidepressant. The NNH is the number needed to harm, meaning for every 23 people, at least in the United States, that are treated with an antidepressant, you're going to get one additional bipolar patient. Okay? So what do we see in the United States with the rise of SSRIs? We see a doubling of the number of people with antidepressants in the course of a decade. Doubling of the number of people with bipolar over the course of a decade. You can see how this is fitting together. Then they did a survey of a patient support group, Depressive and Manic Depressive Association, and 60% of those with a bipolar diagnosis has said, I first had a manic episode after I went on an antidepressant. That became a gateway to a bipolar diagnosis. Now, Fred Goodwin is seen as the guru of manic depressive illness in the United States. He's written about this. He says this: once you iatrogenically, meaning treatment caused, a bipolar disorder, even if you remove the offending antidepressant, you're still seeing this deterioration in sort of mood stability. So this is the leading manic depressive guy in the United States saying antidepressants can induce a bipolar disorder, and when that happens, you get this deterioration in mood stability. The other thing that's quite amazing is that bipolar disorder also now runs a much more chronic course than it used to. People have more cycling. They're much more functionally impaired. If you look at employment rates in the pre-antidepressant era, it can be 70, 75, 80% for manic depressive patients. At least in the United States, we're down to about 30%, 35% that remain employed. And you can see here, my favorite on this is these are all very well-known people, head of the, we're getting this more functional impairment. My favorite quote is, prognosis for bipolar disorder was once considered relatively favorable. That's what I'm just talking about. But contemporary findings suggest that disability and poor outcomes are prevalent despite major therapeutic advances. You see the contradiction there? If you have major therapeutic advances, you would think that the outcomes would be improving. Now, a couple disability studies. This was a study where people went on to short-term disability in Canada. They had missed 10 days of work due to depression. You'll see and then they just looked at those who decided to take an antidepressant, those who did not. Self-selection, not randomized. And you'll see actually there's a lot of people treated with medication who went back to work, right? You see that, 73%? Those people will now attest the medications help them, right? They went back to work. But from a society point of view, those who didn't take medication, it was a higher number that went back to work. And you'll see those who went on to long-term disability was about twice as high for the medicated people. My point here is in this study, you can see a lot of different things. You can see where voices will tell about the medications helping them. Even from a societal point of view, you're seeing a doubling of the disability rate. This was a 6-year study. Also, what is it meant if you look at the hypothesis, what happens if we don't treat depression? So 6 years, again, it's not randomized, it's a naturalistic study. And you'll see that the cessation of role function was about 3 times as high in the treated group, and those that became incapacitated about 6 times as high in the treated group. So, is that me?
Ignore it, no, carry on.
Okay, I got 5 minutes there. One of the things that is sometimes said is the reason for the rising disability in the United States and other countries is we live in this very difficult times. So the prevalence of anxiety and mood disorders has increased. Well, what you see from here from 1991 to 2002, they did surveys, and the prevalence of mood disorders, in fact, did not rise during this time. Okay? It remained stable at around 30% of the population. What changed was the percentage who got treated. It went from 20% to 30%, and as we got more people treated, what do you see? The number on disability due to affective disorders more than tripled. So prevalence stays the same, treatment goes up, we see these rising disability numbers, and you see the percentage of those disorders on disability, it increased from 1 in 188 to 1 in 69. Bipolar illness, now there are different diagnostic patterns in different countries. In the US, we were doing very little diagnosing of bipolar illness in 55, but there were only 12,000 people hospitalized with bipolar illness in 1955. Today, we have 6 million adults with that diagnosis, a rather dramatic increase, and 83% are said to be severely impaired. Now the 6th leading cause of medical-related disability in the world. Real quickly, I think everybody agrees that long-term benzodiazepine use can be problematic. Cognitive impairment, increased depression, functional impairments, physical decline. This is pretty well known. And in fact, benzodiazepines are not recommended beyond short-term use. Unfortunately, they are given. Finally, this is maybe the most surprising data, and we don't really have time in this. This is from the best long-term study of schizophrenia patients done in the United States by Martin Harrell. The hypothesis, he just follows people for 20 years. People get diagnosed early on. He expects that those who stop taking their medications are going to have terrible outcomes. That's the hypothesis. You'll see he found the opposite to be true. There was an 8-fold higher recovery rate in those off antipsychotics. By the way, the off antipsychotic group did better on every domain of functioning. This is the work history of the two groups. Much better for those off medication. What he really found was a lot of recovery of those who got off medication. And here is a graphic that I think is so revealing and raises questions. So in this naturalistic study, he ends up with 4 groups. Schizophrenia on and off meds, and those with milder disorders on and off meds. Now it's naturalistic. People are taking themselves off, okay? But you see what happens? The group that does best is milder disorder off meds, okay? Next group that does best is schizophrenia off meds. Now that's a group with horrible prognosis that's supposed to be terrible. They're doing better than the milder disorders on meds. So my question would be is, why would a group that is off meds with the most devastating diagnosis doing better than those with the milder disorders who are medication compliant? At the very least, it raises a question, right? You'll see that Martin Harrell, look what he's talking about here, and I'm going to finish up, I think, on time. What does he say? How unique among medical treatments is it that the apparent efficacy of antipsychotics could diminish over time or become ineffective or harmful? There are many examples for other medications of similar long-term effects, with this often occurring as the body readjusts biologically to the medications. And so Reef Al-Malik has now raised that maybe we have a universal problem with psychiatric drugs. Maybe they can be effective over the short term, but the problem is that they induce these perturbations in neurotransmitter function. The brain, being this very neuroplastic organ, is now going to try to maintain its normal functioning. It's going to go through these compensatory adaptations, and the drug, because it's going to do the opposite of what the drug is doing. So if you have an antipsychotic that blocks dopamine, your brain is going to try to increase its dopamine capacity. He's saying maybe this is a problem with psychiatric drugs, is they induce this oppositional tolerance, this opposite effect of what is originally intended. And that's why over the long term, drugs that appear effective over the short term have these problems. One, they're difficult to get off of because your brain has become used to the medication. And 2, really they may increase the chronicity of the very disorder they're intended to treat. And 3, they may lead to increased functional impairment. So this was meant to be an argument, a hypothesis, a thesis. And here's how I see it. What is impressive to me is that it's a narrative of science where the evidence fits together. Okay? It's not just reliant on one study. There's a larger narrative of science that can be reviewed here, which I tried to review in 30 minutes. It should probably take a little bit longer than that. But what do we have? We have correlated data across different cultures. We have, I believe, I'm sure there's going to be some argument on this, but I believe there's a robust body of evidence that antidepressants increase the chronicity of depression. You saw the 20-minute version of that. You find that studies find that patients medicated for depression are more likely to end up disabled by the disorder. You have, I believe, again, robust evidence that it increases the risk a unipolar patient will become a bipolar patient. Was a deterioration of course. You'll see evidence that the burden of bipolar hasn't increased. We know benzos are a problem. I think the most controversial may be here that long-term studies of psychotic patients show that that's impairing function over the long term. But I will tell you, where you see the best outcomes in the Western world for schizophrenia and psychotic patients is in northern Finland, where they minimize long-term use of antipsychotics. So they have developed a different use of drugs. And finally, I'm an outsider. I'm a journalist, right? I'm just looking at, I'm trying to uncover a narrative. And you see other researchers who said, I think looking at these studies, we have a problem. And they have proposed a biological explanation to sort of make sense of the research literature. Now, whether that's the actual biological explanation, I don't know. But my point is here, that's a lot of evidence that's fitting together over time. And here we are in 2016, and you're at a parliamentary meeting saying, is there something to worry about? And I'm making the case that is something to worry about. It needs discussion and further study. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Bob. We're going to have time for discussions from you from the floor, and we're also going to hear from other people on the panel next. So we'll probably progress with alternative points of view and then move on to the discussions. I should introduce myself because I'm speaking. So my name is Peter Kinderman. I'm a professor of clinical psychology up at the University of Liverpool, and I'm president of the British Psychological Society. I should also do a declaration of interest, which is I do have dogs in this race. Not only am I a clinical psychologist and therefore I have a perspective, but I'm also a member of the Council for Evidence-Based Psychiatry, which is a co-sponsor of the APPG, and I think collectively we share concerns about the possible harms of medication use. We have sitting around us baronesses, various lords, several MPs, a member of the shadow cabinet, 4 doctors, 2 of whom are professors. But the first person who should speak is probably got the most important perspective of today, which is Paul, to speak from the perspective of people who have used medication. So Paul.
Yeah, thanks Peter, good morning everybody. I'm just going to spend the next 5 minutes and share with you, I guess, the impact that the antidepressant medication has had on my life for the last 20 years or so, and it'll be a very, very quick summary of it. Before medication, I lived a full life. I had a wide circle of friends, close relationships with a number of people, and I engaged in a variety of activities. So I guess the regular activities: cinema, theatre, restaurants, travel, and so on. I was a keen sportsman, so I played football multiple times a week. I played golf and I played tennis. Sadly, I wasn't good enough to be professional, so I had to work at developing a career in IT sales. And I did that over a number of years, working for sort of household name companies like Hewlett-Packard and Alcatel, and generally building up roles of increasing seniority. I lived and travelled abroad and travelled extensively across sort of Europe, Middle East, Africa, the States and Australia. So I lived a very full life. Then I was diagnosed with post-viral syndrome following a virus that I had, and the symptoms didn't resolve. And I was prescribed Prozac. So that's going back probably just over 20 years ago now. At the time when that was prescribed, I wasn't counselled in terms of what the side effects of that medication might be or any potential consequences. And it really then started a cycle probably for the next 13 years. Whereby I didn't really improve over that period of time. In fact, some of the symptoms worsened over that time. Certainly, I found that, again, during that time, I cycled through a variety of different medication types, and I tried to stop taking medication on multiple occasions. Each time that I did that, my symptoms worsened, and that was diagnosed as a need for medication, and I was isolated on medication. In hindsight now, it's my understanding actually that I was experiencing withdrawal each time that happened. Coincidentally, at the same time, I was also misdiagnosed as a type 1 diabetic. So for 5 years, I was injecting insulin 4 times a day unnecessarily. So that had other impacts to me as well. So I'm sort of painting a picture here of life was getting worse, and I was getting worse over time. And my doctors really couldn't offer me any advice or guidance. In fact, in most instances, they were asking me to take additional medications. And I got to the point where I refused to do that, and fortunately had the wherewithal to start to research for myself what may be going on. I mean, and thank God for the internet and availability of information. I came across articles that described antidepressant side effects and withdrawal symptoms, which mapped almost exactly onto the experience that I was going through. And that really gave me the motivation and the determination to stop taking the medication, which I managed to do eventually. So if I look back and think, what was the outcome of taking that medication? Well, as I say, I didn't get any better, and I got worse in some respects, and then became significantly worse after I stopped the medication. And I went into what I now understand to be a protracted withdrawal syndrome, where I then started to experience symptoms that I hadn't previously experienced, which left me, certainly my cognitive and physical capabilities severely degraded to the point I was incapacitated at times. I'll just read just a snippet of some of the symptoms that I had. So memory loss, confusion, poor concentration, unclear thinking, depersonalisation, derealisation, irrational exaggerated fear, blurred vision, painful and aching joints and muscles, lack of coordination. I was forever dropping things, and so multiple intolerances. I became intolerant to a whole wide range of foods, drink, and so on. A lack of energy and brain zaps, which I'm sure you've probably come across, and that's that sort of, it almost feels like a momentary electric shock going through the brain, which is disorientating for a second or two. The impact to me, of course, of that range of symptoms was I didn't work for 5 years. I was incapable of work. So that effectively destroyed the career that I built to date at that point. I have a young son, so I couldn't spend the time with him engaging activities that otherwise I would have done. I became increasingly isolated over time as well, because I couldn't maintain relationships, and of course I didn't have an income coming in, so my financial situation was becoming compromised. Fortunately, I'd set some money aside, so I used that to live on at the time, but I had a pretty frugal existence. And of course all the stress and worry that went with that. I just didn't know what the outcome of this was going to be. Fortunately, over a period of, and so far it's been 8 years, I have steadily and gradually recovered, such that many of those symptoms have now resolved. I still have some, but the severity of those are now reduced. And through that time, I was supported by volunteers from charities. I had very little support from the medical community, and I think just really through no ill will or whatever, it was just a lack of information and understanding about what was happening. So, in terms of, I guess, my outlook now, I'm still continuing to rebuild my life, despite some of the symptoms that I'm still experiencing. I'm back at work now, so that's a good thing. I've been back. I started late 2013, so about 2.5 years now. And I would say I haven't had a day off work actually since then. So that's a good thing. I've probably, in many respects, had one of the best attendance records in the company since I've been working. So I'm on the management team of an IT integration business. So it's fairly demanding work as well. I've been able to stand up to that. So that leaves me confident for the future, whilst I still have challenges going on and the symptoms that are going on. I'm confident they will resolve over time. So I guess there's two final bits I just wanted to touch on. One was, I guess, recommend from a lay person's point of view, somebody that's experienced the medication, just some thoughts and recommendations, I guess. In my situation, it was a first-line solution. That was the first thing that was offered to me was medication, and I would advise against that. I'm sure there are other avenues to be explored. Informed consent, I certainly didn't experience that, and that, of course, delayed my understanding of what might have been happening to me at the time. Regular objective monitoring and professional support during the medication use, change of dosage and withdrawal. That would have had a big impact on me as well. Certainly the long-term use needs to be questioned and affects research, as Robert was just talking about there. And my experience over what was in total about 13 years, I worsened, I didn't improve over that time. And finally, I guess doctor education or medical education and awareness of the possibilities of what can happen with these medications and the outcomes. But that was a big challenge for me because I just didn't know what was happening. A lot of things I had to do were a bit of a leap of faith and personal determination. So I guess again, as a wrap up, I would just summarise, that my journey. I had a very full life before medication, and then during and after medication, I really just have been surviving. Now I'm starting to move forward again, which is a positive thing. I'm disappointed, and I still feel very angry that a large chunk of my life has been severely disrupted by prescription medication. I would like to think, a responsible life before medication, and wasn't involved in recreational drug use and the like. But I was harmed by a drug that was given to me by people that I should have been able to trust. Part of my desire to want to come and speak today was really just to share my experience, and I hope by doing that I can contribute to avoiding other people going through the same experience that I have. And I'm happy at any time to discuss in more detail my journey, and hopefully it will continue with the right trajectory. So thanks for your time.
Fantastic, thanks Paul. Next up, Alan. Alan, as well as being a consultant psychiatrist and academic professor, has two very powerful credentials to his name. The first is that he's director for the Centre for Affective Disorders at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience, King's College London. And the second is that Alan is chair of the Psychopharmacological Committee of the Royal College of Psychiatrists.
Thank you very much. I'm just about to stop being chair of the Psychopharmacology Committee. So I should introduce myself. My name is Allan Young. I do work at the Maudsley Hospital. I work in a multidisciplinary team of psychiatrists, psychologists, neuroscientists, nurses, so on, occupational therapists, and we treat affective disorders. We're national, so we see people from all over the country. We tend to see the more treatment-resistant and difficult cases. And we use every form of therapy going. So we do use psychological therapies, we do use drugs, we use neuromodulation, we combine them, and we're interested in research. Now, I think I'd also like to thank Robert Whitaker for his interesting presentation. Before I go to that, I'd just like to thank Paul, because I think it's very brave for any individual person to stand up and talk about their own experiences. And I think one of the big changes I've seen in the past, well, since the turn of the century, I suppose, is that we're taking a lot more notice of what people are saying. And I think that's important. And it's clear that some people have bad experiences with all treatments, really. Robert Whitaker used the term aggregate data, which means we look at the mean effect. And the mean implies there's a spread of data. So when we consider the harms and benefits of medication, for example, or psychological treatment, there are always going to be some people who differ from the mean on the aggregate and who have bad outcomes. And that's true for all treatments. For example, penicillin, which kicked off the modern pharmaceutical era, invented not that far from here, has saved millions, but there are occasionally people who die from a severe allergic reaction. That's not to minimise Paul's experience. I think it's important to hear, and I think it's worthy of further studies, and we should take it on board. And I would agree with much of what he says about education and so on. I would, however, beware sound bites. I think these are very complex issues, and reducing it to sound bites is not helpful. There was depression in World War II. There's depression and anxiety and mental illness in every conflict, as we're seeing at the moment. Indeed, my own hospital was requisitioned during World War I, and for a few years afterwards as a military hospital to deal with the psychological and psychiatric consequences of conflict. So I wouldn't like anyone to think that I was agreeing that there was no depression in World War II. There's also, if I can perhaps be slightly provocative to Robert, a slight focus on US data in what he's saying. I worked for 6 years in Canada, and it amazed me that the Canadian healthcare system produced outcomes that were much more like the UK and Europe than the United States. I know the United States very well. I don't think people are fundamentally different there, but I think the healthcare system is, and that, for example, skews lots of the data. So in my own particular research field, bipolar disorder, which I'll come on to talk about because I think Robert made some very good points about it, we see very different outcomes in the big US studies than we do in Europe. And that isn't because they're fundamentally different people, it's because the healthcare system distorts things in a different way from it's distorted here. So how do we deal with complex issues where we have lots of evidence and lots of potential points of view to reconcile? Well, I think we've been quite good at it in this country. We have NICE, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, that very exhaustively goes through all of the data and produces clinical guidelines that guide clinicians. They have a hierarchy of evidence where they look at the evidence really ranked and weighted by the scientific credibility. It's a long and consensual process, and you know, people like myself and Dr. Green, who is going to speak in a moment or two, are guided by the NICE guidelines. The NICE guidelines, of course, are subject to revision. It's a rather slow process. We've just done the BAP guidelines, I should say also as a conflict of President-elect of the British Association of Psychopharmacology. These are available online. These are, I think, the current gold standard. These are on antidepressants, and to actually summarise all of the data about antidepressants and psychological treatments and so on took us about 2 years. It was a massive job. So I don't think we should be reducing it to sound bites, but there is evidence there which should guide clinicians. And as you say, doctor education is extremely important. Going back to Robert's data about the bad outcomes in the United States, that's not agreed in European data. So the best, you mentioned the Swiss psychiatrist, I guess that's probably my friend and colleague, Professor Jules Angst. He's followed up the entire population of a Swiss canton, the Zug canton, for 47 years, and he's found that antidepressants actually reduce mortality rates, not only from suicide, but from physical ill health. That's very important data, and of course, it tends to get missed because it's European and Swiss. What about the bipolar issue? Well, I did studies with Jules Angst about bipolar. You mentioned the fact that lots of bipolars are missed. I would entirely concur with this. The issue is the fact that we have depressive episodes, and the episodes which may make the diagnosis of bipolar disorder, the mania or the hypomania, is missed. So people are misdiagnosed as unipolar or major depression, and they're treated with antidepressants. Robert highlighted the issue of possibly antidepressants making the course of illness worse. That's been around for a long time, and I think that's true, and I think scientifically that's as yet unanswered. I wrote a paper a couple of years ago where I said that any antidepressants should go through regulatory trials in bipolar depression as well as major depression, because it would inevitably be used in bipolar depression. Of course, no one took the blind bit of notice, but at least the point is made that these treatments should be assessed. And I think the bipolar issue is extremely important. The study that Angst and I did showed that in 5,500 patients in 16 different countries, about a third or more of people were actually bipolar. And there's a lack of doctor education about detecting and understanding what bipolar disorder is. We see this all the time, and I hate to say it, but I think it's particularly woeful in this country and in this city. So what's to be done? Well, the correlations are impressive. There's a very large number of antidepressants being prescribed. There's a huge amount of disability. I think we're actually spending on the disability spend rather than spending in good mental health care. The situation in mental health care in England since 2012 has become extremely woeful. I mean, very often anxiety and depressive disorders are not being treated in specialist care whatsoever. The provision of service is really woefully inadequate. I would say it's shameful. We do have IACS, which is immediate access to psychological treatments. No responsible professional would say that it should be medication for everyone all the time. There should be the option of psychological treatment, there should be the option of combination. But fundamentally, to have good, holistic, multidisciplinary mental health care, you've got to spend the money. We are spending the money, but it would seem we're spending it on disability payments rather than providing health care that might get people better. So just to conclude, I think any scrutiny of the health, of the harms and benefits of any treatment is good. I think this is a useful committee. But I would say that we've got to be careful that we don't jump to conclusions in too rash a fashion. Unfortunately, the nature of the beast is these things do take a good deal of consideration and judgment. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. One of the interesting things about sitting here today is that I'm holding the ring between different members of the same professional group. So I now hand over to Sami, who is also a professor of psychiatry and also a consultant clinical psychiatrist, consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist. I'm getting my words muddled up, particularly focusing on problems by definition of children. So take it away, Sami.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, first of all, I would like to echo what Professor Young was saying about the importance of taking service user views into account. I think, as he was alluding to, that's been one of the major improvements that has happened in recent years. We are taking service user views more importantly, and there's a very good reason why we're doing that, because the evidence on outcomes suggests that far more important than whatever form of medication or for whatever form of psychotherapy you use, within treatment, the therapeutic alliance is king. It is the factor that influences outcome more than any other one. I'd also want to echo Professor Young's views as a fellow psychiatrist about being very careful about weighing up the evidence and being very careful about avoiding falling into sound bites. Because it's when we look at the evidence that things become alarming, and they're alarming to me as a psychiatrist and many other psychiatrists, because of the sorts of pressures we sometimes come under because of the types of myths that have got popularized, that we treat discrete conditions that exist in the same way as other conditions in medicine exist, and that we have very specific treatments for them. So we've heard this morning some of the very convincing evidence that Robert Whitaker put forward, that in our mental health care we seem to be going backwards, not forwards. So whilst outcomes and rates of disability as a result of health problems are improving in most of the rest of medicine, in psychiatry we seem to be going backwards. So our treatments seem to be associated with increasing rates of disability. If we look at things like the outcomes that real-life mental health clinical services are achieving, we see things like a review of the outcomes of real-life community mental health treatments in America, and I take very much Professor Young's points that there are differences in the way we do healthcare. As many as 75% of people who enter a mental health care system don't recover, become chronic patients. But we actually see a very similar picture in terms of outcomes for people receiving mainstream mental health care in this country, including figures like up to 60% of people are dropping out of treatment. They're somehow not being able to engage in the way that treatment is being delivered. Things like the increasing access to psychological therapies doesn't seem to have made any dent or made any evidence that it's improved this picture. So, for example, the Centre for Social Justice, in one of their reports, when they looked at the data from the IAPT projects, found that as few as 15% of people who were referred to IAPT projects were categorized as recovered. And so the issue is not just about increasing funding. If we're going to increase funding to systems that the evidence overwhelmingly says are associated with bad outcomes, why on earth would you want to increase funding to that? We do need increased funding. I mean, he's right that we've got some crisis in funding within mental health services, but much more important than that, we need to change the models that we're using in our mental health services. We see this similar pattern of evidence in public health campaigns. So we had the Defeat Depression campaign in this country that ran for several years. The outcomes from that was increasing number of people being prescribed antidepressants, but in terms of clinical outcomes, there was absolutely no improvement whatsoever in terms of the clinical outcomes. There was another large one in Australia called Beyond Blue, which was another public health campaign allied to building new services. again that's been running for about 2 decades, and the evaluations of the outcomes from that one found a curious finding, that if you were categorized as having poor mental health knowledge, that acted as a protective factor. Your likelihood of having a good outcome was associated with you being categorized as having poor mental health knowledge. That meant that those who didn't believe that their depression was an illness that required treatment by a medical means had better outcomes than those who did. So we've got all this evidence that's stacking up and telling us that the concepts we are using are faulty, and as a result, the treatments that we are using are prone to that same sort of error. Can I have 1 more minute?
You can have 5.2 seconds.
Oh, come on, give me 1 more minute. I just want to mention one study, which is the largest study that was done of depression. It's still the largest study, large multi-center study that compared antidepressants, placebo, cognitive behavior therapy, and interpersonal therapy. There was no difference in outcomes, no matter what treatment you received. So somebody receiving placebo had, on average, just as good an outcome, not only of somebody having an antidepressant, but also somebody having a proper structured psychological therapy. But when you followed them long term, the people who did best were those people who were never put on medication. But the message from that sort of research is that the things that people need is you cannot escape the idea of matching treatment to a diagnosis just doesn't work. It is not the thing that leads to better outcomes. All the evidence says that with each unique therapeutic encounter, it is a unique therapeutic encounter. You can't get away from that process of negotiating a meaningful intervention with whoever you are working with. So in terms of solutions, we need greater public education to dispel some of these myths, to hopefully help the public understand that the sorts of treatments and the medications and the diagnosis that we are using don't have an evidence base to support them. We need to look at better ways of commissioning services, for example, commissioning them by their outcomes rather than by what they do at the moment, which is by process. We need to look at training of doctors to help them think beyond the psychiatric classifications and to help them understand that in psychiatry we don't have diagnosis, we have a system of classification. And we need guidelines to take into account this evidence and produce guidelines, which they don't do at the moment, about when you prescribe medication, how long you should prescribe it for, and how do you help people come off that.
Sounds a genius psychiatrist, but terrible at counting to 5.2 seconds. Declaration of interest is that I have written at least one paper with Jo Moncrieff, and she very kindly proofread a book chapter that I wrote on psychiatric medication. So there's a declaration of interest of friendship here between the two. So I'm going to hand over to Joanna Moncrieff, who is also consultant psychiatrist, in her case working with adults, working age.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for inviting me to talk. As Peter said, I'm an adult psychiatrist. I'm a member of the Council for Evidence-Based Psychiatry as well. I'm also a member of something called the Critical Psychiatry Network. So I am coming from a particular perspective, similar to Sami's on these issues. But just to say that the Critical Psychiatry Network, for example, has hundreds of members all over the world. So we're not mainstream psychiatric opinion, but we do represent a strand of psychiatric opinion. I'm going to concentrate on antidepressants and say a few further words about antidepressants, picking up some of the things that Robert said in his talk that I think could do with some more emphasis. And the first thing I want to say is that despite common perception, there really is no evidence that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance, and no evidence that antidepressants rectify or even help to reverse or correct a chemical imbalance. This is a myth that has been put about very effectively by the pharmaceutical industry, and most psychiatrists and leading psychopharmacologists would not stand by it anymore. Nevertheless, I feel it's important to say that because the pharmaceutical industry has been so successful and achieved such wide publicity that very many people believe this is true still. The second thing I want to emphasise is, as Bob said, antidepressants are drugs that act on the brain. Because they act on the brain, they are what we sometimes refer to as mind-altering drugs. They are drugs that alter the way that people normally think and experience emotions and behave. They change normal feelings, thoughts, and behaviour. They're not very strong psychoactive drugs like, for example, Valium or Largactil or chlorpromazine, which have much sort of more noticeable immediate effects. The effects of at least the modern antidepressants that we use are quite subtle and are more like that they cause a certain degree of emotional blunting, a bit of lethargy, and in young people they seem to have this tendency occasionally to produce agitation and tension, which may be associated with suicidal feelings and thoughts on some occasions. But we really don't know very much about how they change the functions of the brain, how they change behaviour and feelings, because there's been very little research on this, because research has been focused on this idea that they're correcting a chemical imbalance, they're a specific treatment for the disease of depression. So, for example, I can't find a single study of long-term study of how they affect animal behaviour. In fact, I can't find a single short-term study of how they affect animal behaviour in the published literature. There is one study about the effects on the offspring of rats that have taken an SSRI antidepressant during pregnancy, and those offspring are found to show decreased exploratory behaviour, decreased initiative, and hyperactivity and agitation, and when they reach maturity they show reduced sexual behaviour compared to the offspring of rats that have not taken those drugs. So there is some indication that these drugs might be having negative effects on behaviour after long-term use. But the main point that we ought to really be thinking about is we are prescribing these drugs by the millions, and yet we actually don't really know what they do when people take them for years and years, as people usually do. And we don't know, apart from the powerful testimonies like Paul's that we've heard today, what happens when people stop taking them after taking them for years and years. Another myth that I want to expose is the idea that antidepressants are effective. It's my view and others that there is no evidence that antidepressants actually help depression, that they actually work in the way that they are meant to work. Now, of course, many psychiatrists and people who've taken these drugs will tell you, but of course they work. You know, I've taken these for a couple of weeks and I feel a lot better, or, you know, I know my patients are better when they come back after a couple of weeks. The problem is that we know that most people will feel better if they come back in a couple of weeks, especially if they've been offered a treatment that they believe is going to be helpful. This is why we do placebo-controlled trials. And what placebo-controlled trials show is that the difference between an antidepressant and a placebo is minuscule. It is 2 points on a 54-point rating scale of random possible symptoms of depression. And that difference is not detectable when you use other sorts of rating scales. For example, clinicians rating whether they think someone shows any degree of improvement. That difference doesn't even reach the threshold for a minimal degree of improvement on a commonly used clinician rating scale for degrees of global improvement. Moreover, the difference between antidepressants and placebo doesn't necessarily indicate that there's actually a therapeutic effect going on, that the drugs are working on the depression. It can easily be accounted for by the mind-altering effects that antidepressants produce, both in terms of the fact that they dampen emotions and therefore people may be less in touch with their depressed feelings, but also because most people are aware, or many people who take them are aware that they're taking an active drug, and therefore the placebo effect of taking an antidepressant is enhanced compared to the placebo effect of taking a placebo in these placebo-controlled trials, remembering that most people who go into these trials go in because they believe that medication is helpful and they want to get the active medication. So I'm not surprised that the increased use of antidepressants is not reducing the prevalence and chronicity of depression that exists in the community, as Bob showed in his talk. Is it actually making things worse? Of course, this is the big question that we're here to consider. I recently published data on benefit statistics in the UK, and the really noticeable effect in this data was not only that rates of people claiming benefits for mental disorders were going up, and those were mostly people with depressive or anxiety disorders, but that rates of people claiming benefits for other common medical disorders were coming down. When I looked at benefit figures in the mid-1990s, musculoskeletal disorders, particularly back pain, were far and away the biggest cause of receiving sickness and disability benefits from the state. From about the mid-1990s, they start to come down, and the rates of people receiving benefits for mental disorders, mostly common mental disorders, goes up. So, and as people have pointed out, this coincides with a massive increase in the use of antidepressants. In this country, the use of antidepressants has gone up 4 times since the early 1990s. So, are antidepressants contributing to that picture? Are they possibly making the situation worse? We've heard one way in which they might be from Paul, that some people who come off them seem to have very protracted and very severe experiences of withdrawal. Thankfully, that's not everyone. We don't know what proportion of people that is, but it certainly occurs unfortunately, for some people. And I also think that the fact that so many people stay on antidepressants long term now is partly because of difficulties coming off antidepressants. So people might not get to the state of these really severe withdrawal symptoms because they simply can't sort of get started on withdrawal in the first place. Another reason is the pharmacological effects of the antidepressants. If that animal behaviour study is right and it coincides with what patients say about the sort of state that these drugs induce, states of lethargy and emotional dampening, it seems that after long-term use at least, these drugs may be reducing people's motivation and initiative and ability to get back into life and into the workplace. But another point I want to mention, which I think is really important, is the psychological effects of prescribing antidepressants. I think these are really, really important and really underestimated. Of course, psychiatrists and GPs never prescribe a drug and say, this is all you need to do, just go away and take this drug and everything will be right. They, hopefully, most of them anyway, give advice to people about other things they could do to make them feel better, ways they could change their life, therapy that might be helpful, and other sorts of interventions. But I think that many people, when they are given a pill, hear a message that this is a problem, you have a problem with your brain, you need this drug to put it right, and that nothing much that you can do will make a difference. And that is a profoundly disempowering effect. And it's a message that I think potentially sets people up for a lifetime of chronicity. When things go wrong in people's lives again, they'll be thinking, oh dear, I need, there's nothing I can do, this is my brain chemistry going wrong, I need to go back to the doctor and get another prescription or change my antidepressant, rather than people actually feeling, maybe I could do something about this situation, maybe there's some way that I could change the circumstances that might have brought me here. So just to sum up very quickly, doctors are, I work clinically, I was working in an acute care practice, seeing a lot of referrals from general practice of people who've been diagnosed with depression, started on antidepressants. There is a widespread expectation that all sorts of problems should be dealt with a prescription. Doctors need to say no to that, learn to say no to that more often, and need to look to alternatives. Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Still on the medical side, but a very important part of the picture is the role of general practitioners. And Andrew is currently chair of the GP's Clinical and Prescribing Subcommittee at the British Medical Association. So, Andrew.
Thank you. It's been a fascinating morning, and it brought to mind actually, as we're sat here, a patient I'm very fond of, who's been on and off citalopram for 10 years or so, and I was discussing with him whether this was really a good thing to do. And the pros and cons. And he said, Dr. Green, when I'm off medication, I love Radio 3. And when I'm on it, I can't get beyond Classic FM. And I thought it was so perceptive of the problems that we face. You'll be relieved to know psychopharmacology is not my area of expertise at all. But after 30 years of general practice, what I do have expertise in is knowing how people react when they're in bother and knowing about what goes on behind the closed doors of the consulting room. And what I'd like to do is to describe for you and not necessarily defend the current position as honestly as I can. I don't think I've ever met a GP who wishes they could prescribe more drugs for mental illness. So whatever our position on this, I think we can all share the same goal of trying to reduce prescribing. This is a really important subject. And the main reason I'm here really today is because of the work on drug dependence the BMA's already done, and I do commend our report of October of last year to you. I'd like to talk mostly about antidepressant prescribing, I'm afraid, as these are the drugs that are most commonly initiated in primary care. And to understand this, we do need to step backwards and see the bigger picture. As people have said, we really do live in quite extraordinary times. For the first time in our evolutionary history, there is an expectation of happiness, and perhaps even a belief that unhappiness or distress is an abnormality that should be cured. We live in a period where inequality is increasing, despite the evidence that people in more equal societies are happier and healthier at all levels of that society, unbelievably including those at the very top. And we live in a world where billions of pounds are spent fostering a belief that to have more stuff is to be a better person, and where a company can persuade someone to go into debt to buy a Galaxy S6 and then use the same bit of kit 6 months later to persuade them they can't be happy unless they've got an S7. It really is most upsetting. When people begin to buckle under these pressures, we've also removed the traditional support networks of family and religion, and we've lost community and employment stability. So where do society's casualties turn? Well, they turn to the person who's free, who is available, who is confidential, and that's often their GP. And when they come to us, they expect help, and some of them even expect a cure. And we've got to look at what, in practical terms, people like me can offer them. Well, I could, and I try to, offer them myself. And I love this phrase, the therapeutic alliance is key. This is so important. It can be enough. But to be honest, I'm a resource in desperately short supply. I live in the world so well described last week by the King's Fund in their report, Understanding Pressures in General Practice. It's a treadmill world of rushed 10-minute appointments, of endless compromise, and indeed, even when seeing one patient inevitably means that another patient can't be seen. Now, I could, and I don't, simply do nothing at all, just ignore the problem. And it's absolutely true that for many, depression is a self-limiting illness. But it's a particularly miserable one for the patient and their loved ones. And in the time taken to recover, people can lose their jobs, they can lose their families, they lose their homes, and sadly they can lose their lives. I could, and I do, offer talking therapies. But there then comes an inevitable question, which is, how long will I have to wait? And I have to say, well, you'll get a call in a couple of weeks from the single point of access, and then you'll go on a waiting list, and that could be 5, 6, 7 months. And sadly, talking therapies can be almost the same as just doing nothing. In fact, the choice agenda, so beloved of governments, is exposed as the illusion it so often is. Now, I could, and I sometimes do, offer a prescription. This is not an action taken lightly, but it can be the only option available. Now, if you believe that it's wrong for a GP to choose that option, please bear in mind that we don't act in isolation. We have guidance to help us. And the guidance is explicit and it might surprise you. In England, NICE is very clear. It says, provide antidepressants to those with moderate disease. Continue for between 6 months and 2 years. It also recommends antidepressants for those with mild disease in certain circumstances, even though it acknowledges the lack of evidence for their use. Now, Professor Haslam of NICE has said through many times, guidelines are guidelines, not tramlines. But GPs are obliged to consider them. And if deviating, we do have to be able to show the reasons why. And many GPs are understandably anxious about explaining why they've deviated from guidance to people like Collins. Now, please don't think I don't share your concerns about the levels of mental illness in our population. I'm certainly not dismissing concerns about the levels of prescribing that we see. It really couldn't be further from the truth. But I do believe this is an extremely complex problem with roots in the very civilization in which we live. And answers, if they're going to be found, are as likely to be found in the world of politics and philosophy as they are in medicine.
Echo what we should have said earlier, that the BMA's work on the prescription drugs is great, and I think it's fantastic, and it's part of the work that we're doing here. And I think that your talk brings us very nicely on to the issue of social justice. So, Baroness Stroud, as the Director of the Centre for Social Justice, far away.
Thank you so much. And can I just take 1 second to congratulate the APPG. So many APPGs are not run as well as this one is, and for drawing attention to these really important issues. My first experience of, in detail, of prescription medication was actually having a young woman live with us for 10 years who went through the withdrawal process in our home. From beginning to end, probably took about 2.5 years. And it was a very, very painful experience for her, and a very scary experience as well. So the issues that we're discussing this morning are extremely close to my heart. The CSJ is probably better known for its work on addictions to illegal drugs and legal highs, but because our focus is always on the most disadvantaged, we did do some research into the issue of dependence on prescription drugs. And our work actually showed that the prescribing of drugs, prescription drugs by doctors is causing harm, particularly in our poorest communities, which is why it was of interest to us. There are up to 1.5 million people addicted to medication in the UK today, and in England data shows that overprescribing particularly affects our poorest areas such as Blackpool, Salford and Newcastle. They have, for example, around 3 times as many antidepressant prescriptions as some of our inner London wealthier boroughs. And this was something that we felt was not appropriate. Why was it that people from disadvantaged communities were particularly being offered prescription medication where others may have better access to health interventions? So what is driving the overprescribing of drugs? And one of the first things that we picked up on was that it was being driven by short patient contact, as has just been mentioned, short patient contact time, and a system which did too little to encourage non-medical interventions. The poor communities in Britain, as I've just said, were in danger of following the US into an epidemic of prescription drug abuse. And that the consequences for prescribed medication addiction were much the same as Paul has just described, as in fact any other drug use, with higher chances of worklessness, family breakdown and an increased burden on the NHS. And these were very real issues that we felt needed to be highlighted. So poor prescribing practice was also something that we wanted to highlight. The CSJ heard that poor prescribing practice was one of the main reasons why strong medications are prescribed. And contrary to NICE guidelines, which state that due to the long-term addictive consequences, benzodiazepines should be a limited short-term measure during crises, they are in fact prescribed for far longer in many cases, and part of that is the nervousness of coming off those drugs. And as also just been mentioned, GP consultations of 10 minutes are not long enough to get to the root causes of a problem. We've been told that a consultation is not long enough to get to those root causes of complex psychosocial problems. Prescribing a potentially addictive painkiller, sleeping tablet or sedative can make for a less demanding session, but actually a potentially more harmful one for the patient. But also this is because of a lack of talking therapies is leaving doctors feeling they have no choice. I mean, listening to Andrew, I felt like I can absolutely understand the choices that GPs are facing. One GP told the CSJ talking therapies aren't there because GPs want to support someone. They can end up prescribing because there's nothing else to do, and you feel like you want to be able to do something for this person who's sitting in front of you. What are your choices as a GP? I know we're limited for time, so just one other aspect that I wanted to touch on. So the second aspect of this debate that concerns us as a think tank is the medicalising of the treatment for childhood and of children, which hasn't really been touched on this morning. The most recent national survey of mental health among children and young people in Britain was in fact carried out in 2004 by the Office for National Statistics and published by the Health and Social Care Information Centre, finding that almost 10% of our young people had a mental health disorder, and that rates of mental health problems in children and young people in the UK are rising rapidly, particularly conduct and emotional disorders. Levels of self-harm are increasing. 1 in every 12 and 1 in 15 children and young people are deliberately self-harming. These are really not great stats for our next generation. More than half of all adults with mental health problems were diagnosed in childhood, and less than half were appropriately treated at that time. What could have happened if that intervention in childhood had been more effective? And one of the reasons why we're again concerned is that it's 72% of children in care have behavioural or emotional problems. So again, it's the very vulnerable. And then our young offenders, 95% of imprisoned young offenders have a mental health disorder. These are the people that we particularly work with, are particularly concerned about, and will be particularly concerned about the overprescribing of medication. So really the quick questions, the CSJ's questions, my questions as I was thinking about this morning talking with children is, as a society, we need to be asking ourselves firstly, why are our children as a nation presenting in such a way? What social factors have changed that we as a society need to take responsibility for and change? A huge amount has changed in the last 20 to 30 years. The internet, sexting, cyberbullying, childcare, family fragility. Do we know? And if we did know, would we do something about it? As adults, it's in our power to do something about this. This is the silent scream of the next generation, and we need to address it. Thank you.
Right. My agenda tells me two things, that we're 10 minutes late and that I've got to ask Robert whether he would like to respond to any of the panel comments, or possibly he might want to say no, let's turn it over to the...
I can take a hint, no, let's turn it over.
Far away. Okay, now I don't know how to tell you, so let's go put the back towards the front. So we do have some mics here, but I'm not sure if anybody is able to... Well, shout out and see whether we can hear you.
I'm Bob Johnson. I'm a College of Psychiatrists, and I did 20 years in general practice. And I've got 2 points which I want to make very, very carefully. We need truth in prescribing. If we listen to Joanna Moncrieff, she says that all psychiatric drugs work by intoxication. Therefore, what doctors are doing, GPs or consultant psychiatrists, they are prescribing medicinal brandy, and they should know this. I'd like to take that. The second thing is, what Joanna said, well, maybe I could do something. I've studied the DSM from DSM-1 all the way through, and the one thing they take away is the initiative on the part of the patient. The patient has determination, the patient has choice, the patient has what you might call willpower, but the DSM ignores that, and much of psychiatry ignores that. You need to say, let's go into what you can do about it and increase your coping skills.
We'll take 3 questions. I'll ask the panel to get back. So let's work forward from the back, and we'll take another white male. Yeah.
Okay. I'm Niall Boss, editor of Lancet Psychiatry. I'm afraid that I started off being somewhat disappointed by what I thought was an unfortunate comment from you, Paul Flynn. The implication being that there didn't used to be... Thank you, I wanted to shout now. Is this on? Good. The implication being that there didn't used to be depression during the war, and that it's just that people somehow expect too much from life. And, some people actually struggle every day simply to stay alive, and I felt that your opening remarks really risked trivializing their suffering. My disappointment has, alas, to some extent continued with this debate, with the exception of Paul Brett's very vivid account, which reminds us of the need to increase the degree of patient involvement in research and the need for meaningful communication and choice in the clinic. What we've heard is pro and con, but I don't get the sense of whether all these studies we've heard about have been systematically searched for or cherry-picked, if they've been systematically evaluated, if populations are comparable, if baseline characteristics are comparable. Often I haven't heard absolute numbers, I haven't heard numbers needed to treat, numbers needed to harm, the statistical or indeed clinical significance of observed effects. We've heard quotes from people and appeals to evidence, but I don't care who you are or where you're from, I care about data. And one of the great things about the scientific method is that it's a social leveler. So if you're asking about action, I think the first thing we need to do is actually really systematically look and synthesize this data, write it up, get it peer reviewed, get it published, and then perhaps we can actually start an informed discussion.
We'll take a white female, and then I'll ask a couple of panelists to comment.
My name's Deborah Fielding. I work in a substance misuse agency in Bradford. I'm a benzodiazepine specialist, and I do the community detoxes with the involuntary addicts. Professor Ashton has been asking for years for the stats to be released from the GP surgeries of the patients who are on benzos. I'm very lucky that I'm in those surgeries doing this work. If I had the time or the money, I'd do research, and I think you'd be shocked with what I would present today. I support these patients fully. I follow Professor Ashton's guidelines of withdrawal. It's much easier than people think when their patients are fully supported. The reduction's done slowly and properly. The doctors don't have time to do this, and sometimes the knowledge. We need more workers like me. There's only me. I get emails from America, Bulgaria, Italy, as well as Scotland, Ireland, Wales every day. Heartbreaking emails, and I answer them all on my own. It is quite shocking.
Okay.
Can I just say, one thing that I'm being mentioned is the link between prescriptions and disability benefits. A lot of my patients openly say, don't take my drugs off me, that's how I get my benefits. And they share with each other. If you say you've got anxiety and depression, you get drugs and you don't have to go on job seekers, and it doubles your money.
I want lots of people to talk because we're in Parliament, but I also want people who say things to get answers to them, and there's some questions. So just very briefly, Alan, do you want to respond to the idea that all medication is brain damaging medicinal branding?
I worked with Heather Ashton for years. I've done many papers with her, and I've got a huge amount of respect for her. She actually beat me at squash when she was about 30 years older than me.
Hell of a woman.
Yeah, she is. Yeah. And she would say that the situation with the benzodiazepines is entirely different from the antidepressants. I think that's probably the scale. I mean, it's possible there are people who would benefit from it, but I don't think she would agree at all that we should apply the same issue. Can I also just briefly defend Newcastle? I mean, I took from Baroness Stroud that in Newcastle, where I was a consultant for 11 years, they were getting a poor service. I was a consultant there for 11 years, I've been a consultant in London for 5 years. The GP networks in the secondary care are much better in Newcastle than they are in London, so they're not getting a poor service by default.
But greater prescribing.
Yes, but I think you're making a mistake of inferring things beyond the data.
Thank you. Andrew, as a GP, what's your take on the idea that prescribing medication for mental health issues reduces the personal agency on the part of the person receiving it?
I think that's absolutely true, and I think that empowering patients and increasing patient understanding is absolutely key. I'm fortunate enough to live on the north bank of the Humber. When patients come to see me with acute anxiety, they look at me a bit oddly at first when I give them a history lesson. And I talk to them about what life was like in about 1867 when the Vikings were sailing up the Humber. But then when I explain that the reaction they're having in Asda is exactly the same as the reaction that they would have had when they saw the Viking ship, and that one is appropriate, one isn't appropriate, all of a sudden the penny drops. And that's far more important than prescribing.
And just to follow that, I know there are lots of questions, but either Joe or Sami, I don't mind which, but people have serious problems, and dismissing them as just part of life might avoid diagnosis and medication, but it misses the point of how terrible people's sufferings are. Response?
Can I just say how much I enjoyed your brief contribution, because I think it really brought home the challenges of frontline keep working. which there are a lot of echoes for me as a clinician about how you get a lot more time than you, but these are very real questions, and I think they echo very much what the person from the floor was talking about the kind of real suffering that we are, and I very much echo your points that actually the nature of suffering is something that goes beyond just thinking about healthcare. It involves politics, it involves economy, it involves resources, it involves all of these things. I think that's a point really important, really well taken. And in terms of data, of course, in an ideal world, we would have the time to sit down and look at these studies carefully. But one of the things that I'm very aware of is that there has been a tendency, because as a psychiatrist, and I consider myself a scientist, for me it is very important that we look at all of these data and understand methodology, understand what populations we're talking about, understand if we're comparing like with like, not make the mistake of making correlations with comparisons, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think there has been a real tendency for some of the obfuscation of what the findings are by what I call scientism. So there is a trend, and it's very lively in mental health and in psychiatry, psychiatric journals in particular, to present the idea that if you're doing something that looks like science, then that makes what we're finding scientific. And I call this, this is scientism. This is the equivalent of having science as akin to a system of faith. But in terms of the actual evidence, there are many leading proponents, including the ex-editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, who've done very robust reviews about the nature of evidence in psychiatry, and basically said the psychiatric system, in terms of diagnoses and medications, the evidence doesn't stack up. People like Peter Kinderman, who's the director of the Nordic Cochrane Centre, who said very similar things. So that the robustness of the evidence of the position that I think critics like myself are putting forward, I think stand very rigorously to a proper, rigorous scientific scrutiny.
Cool. More democracy there, and then second, yeah.
I'm Millie Keeve. Chair and founder of April. I'm the Psychiatric Reactions Information Link. I speak for patients. I've had health conferences. I want to thank Paul Flynn because he's one of the steadfast MPs who sticks with all this, harm that's been done by the way, unfortunately, GPs have been shortchanged, I believe, because clinical pharmacology and therapeutics was taken out of medical education by the General Medical Council in 1992. So a doctor can qualify with no evidence of that he can prescribe safely, or that he or she would understand iatrogenic illness. I have trustees. One of them, her daughter was on Dianet, which causes depression, and after 10 years of campaigning, there is now a warning, even a suicide warning, and it's a black triangle drug. She was put on Prozac plus a beta blocker. Prozac is not meant to cause death if you take an overdose, but beta blocker can stop your heart. She is dead. She's 20. She was 20. Another trustee suffered seizures after Prozac. When she tried to get benefits, a 50-page form was all about drugs. Very hard to get benefits if you're not taking medication. And she won't, because she now has many, many sensitivities, as you mentioned, to food, to chemicals, to anything. So for her, she goes through a nightmare trying to continue with benefits. She wants to work because she has seizures. It's very, very difficult. And I would also like to mention that organisations like BMA, NICE, why are they so slow in doing things? I was at the BMA having a meeting, and they said, we're really worried. The industry's going into Southampton University and educating the students, the pharmaceutical industry. And I said, well, you should be worried. What did they do about it? I went to NICE. I was a stakeholder on the depression guidelines. the first thing I thought, good, I can actually get something done here. I said, please will you put in the guidelines that before a doctor prescribes antidepressants, he checks that the drug that the person is taking, could be statins, could be an antibiotic, could be Dianet, is not causing the depression. They just said, no, we won't do that. I walked out. What was the point of me being there?
Yeah.
Thank you.
And there we are. Thank you.
So, behind you, that way, just catching eyes.
Thank you. I'm Mary Watkins. I am a mental health nurse and was an acute psychiatric ward sister and a CPM. But perhaps more importantly, I want to just draw the attention that for some people, drugs do work. I had a breakdown when I was at school. I was treated once. I'm 61. I've never had a recurrence. I had an excellent relationship with a therapist that worked with me as well. And I would argue that we are slightly in danger of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I want to ask the question, do you think that the Genome Project may assist us in better understanding on which patients we should target, which drugs, because for some people they are successful and for some they are a disaster?
Can I answer that?
Yeah, well, I was going to come to you, Don. Yeah, do it now. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I think the problem with mental health and psychiatry in terms of the pharmacological approach is that we're about 50 years behind the rest of medicine. If you look at the rest of medicine, they're talking about precision medicine, stratification. If you look at, for example, breast tumours, well, cancer used to be thought of as one illness, and then it was thought of as being on one side. Breast tumours were subdivided into those with and without estrogen receptors and so on and so forth. And a huge advance in cancer care that's happened in the past 20 years could be replicated in terms of understanding and designing better treatments for psychiatry. However, there are things that we do well in mental health, and that's the stuff which is perhaps done less well in other parts of medicine, and that's the talking therapies and the more holistic approach. I would actually argue for both, but that requires investment.
But my personal take is I think that the Genome Project is going to be great for working out what the effects of drugs are going to be on people, because we'll know about the way in which our biological systems respond to the chemicals that we're being prescribed. My personal view is it's not going to tell us much about the origin of mental health problems, but it's going to help prescribers a very great deal to avoid harm, would be my take.
Yeah, I think that's, I would agree with you. I think the best guess is to try and identify people who've got particular characteristics that might mean they're not going to do well with drugs, and that's what's happening in other areas of medicine.
Can I just make a very quick point in response to what you said? I think that some drugs that we have are useful in some situations for some people. I don't think you can make a blanket statement either way, but as far as antidepressants are concerned, I think the evidence, both in terms of their pharmacology and what they do and in terms of the trials, doesn't really indicate that they are helpful. I think there are some other drugs that in some circumstances are.
Cool, let's go. So that, try shouting first.
Right, well, I can shout, I'm good at that. Jane Brilliant, founder of Satira Bradford and trustee of ISPS UK. So really, really interesting, everything we've heard. So I'm quite sad that we've only heard a little bit about the damage of the long-term use of antipsychotics. It's there on the, but I think it is just as serious, probably not such a wider problem. So I want to raise 3 points quickly. I think it's really, really important that prescribers are aware of their duty to really ensure that the person they are prescribing, whether they're detained under the Mental Health Act or not, are ensuring that they are getting informed consent to treat from their patients. They have a duty to do that, and very few, as far as I know, are doing that. Yeah. Also, we need to consider the effects of, the consequences of not doing that can be coercive treatment and the damage that that can do in itself. Being forced to take medication is very damaging. But also, I would like to hear from Bob. He briefly mentioned the best outcomes, which is in northern Finland. Could we just hear a little bit about that? That would be great. Yeah.
Well, real quickly, just listen to this. From a big point of view, the disability numbers, they're not unique to the United States. And I think they really do raise a question about, is this paradigm of care working? And we've had this paradigm, this sort of very drug-based paradigm of care where you diagnose a lot of people now for 35 years, and all the markers from a societal point of view are of a rising burden of mental illness, which tells you need to rethink that paradigm of care, in my opinion. So one of the places that rethought the paradigm of care is in northern Finland, and they really rethought it even with the conception of what's going on. Instead of saying that psychosis is necessarily a brain disease and you got to fix that brain, they had a conception that psychosis arises from the in-between spaces of people. In other words, you got to fix the environment, that sort of thing. And around antipsychotics, they developed a selective use model. They did not put people on antipsychotics right away to see if they could get people through the first psychotic episode without going down that medication route. They did use benzos to help restore sleep. However, it's not an anti-med model. If people weren't getting better after a certain period of time, they did use antipsychotics. But really in Joanna's model, not as a fix, an antidote to psychosis, but as a tranquilizer that can then, help reduce anxiety, that sort of thing. And then finally, if those are once people are put on, they see who can come off successfully. So it's really a selective use model that's designed to see for whom and for how long, which is usually a good principle of medication use. And where are they at today? Well, 80% of their first episode psychotic patients are asymptomatic or working or back in school at the end of 5 years. That's much, in other words, only about 20% have gone down this chronic route. It's very, very different. In terms of use of antipsychotics, at the end of 5 years, about 67% of their patients have never been exposed to antipsychotics. Another 13% have used them temporarily, and 20% are now on them long term. So what's the point? It's a selective use model. It's not an anti-use model. But it begins with reconceiving of what is possible away from this chronic story that I think is so debilitating to a humble story. We really don't know what's going on. And there is often in nature an extraordinary capacity to recover from psychosis, depression, mania, and trying to take advantage and nurture that natural capacity for resilience and recovery. So that's an example of a different paradigm of care that is being adopted in some places in the UK.
We've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to get 3 more people to comment. So at the back there. Yes. Sorry, no, behind you. Sorry.
I really wanted to follow that up, actually.
Okay, we'll take 4 people, but we've got to be very quick. So you're down a shorter time than you otherwise would have.
Okay. My name is Whitaker. I come here as a survivor of SSRIs. I had a whole year of my life taken away by antidepressants that I didn't need. I wasn't completely depressed. I was going through an ordinary life experience, divorce in that instance. I had an adverse reaction to one antidepressant. I was given more and more at the end of that year. I couldn't function at all. I went from being a capable career woman to wandering around in a dressing gown, dribbling with beginnings of neurological damage. I was extremely lucky. I ended up sectioned in a hospital. They took me off all the drugs. And within a few weeks, I was completely better. Many people that I've come across weren't as lucky as me. I've come across many who have suffered far worse. In that entire year, there wasn't a single doctor or a single psychiatrist who recognised that I was experiencing the side effects of these pills. My question is that how can we educate our medical profession that the side effects of these pills mimic the disease that they are supposed to be treating? Because I have come across so many people, like myself, who for years and years and years are on these drugs and cannot get off them.
Thank you. James at the back. Hi, James.
Thanks, James Davis. Just a couple of points. The first was that I didn't read Paul as saying there was no suffering after the Second World War. I read him as critiquing our tendency to turn it into psychiatric disease.
Right.
Of emotional distress. The second point is, it's right, Andrew, you say that doctors follow guidelines. And the guidelines say you can prescribe an antidepressant for moderate depression. But what constitutes moderate depression? Well, you have to go to the tool that tells you what it is. And interestingly, the tool that dominates in the NHS today is the PHQ-9. Now that was developed by, paid for, the distribution was paid for by, and the copyright is owned by Pfizer Pharmaceuticals. And the reason I think Pfizer Pharmaceuticals got behind this document is because it sets the bar for what constitutes moderate and mild depression remarkably low. Okay, so when we're talking about following guidelines, we also have to ask the question, from where do these guidelines come?
In my view, these guidelines are over-medicalising natural and normal, albeit painful human responses where the conditions are.
On the basis of democracy by clamour, far away.
Thank you. My name is Margaret Turner. I'm Secretary of the Satiric Network. I'm also a former approved social worker. And we've heard about, Joanna was saying about the need to look at alternatives. We've heard about the construing of experience as illness as being disempowering. I absolutely agree with that. As a Secretary of the Satiric Network, I get a lot of emails from people sort of saying, I'm being coerced to have this, and I want alternatives, and where are they, and so on. Jen knows about, and Bob was referring to, I think, open dialogue, which does construe what is happening as experience in a social context. And I think that is not being given enough exposure, really, the social context in which things happen. And as a social worker, it has sometimes broken my heart to see people taken into hospital and just drugged, and nobody has listened to what I have had to say with them about what has been going on in their lives that has brought them to this very critical point. And that is what we need to give attention to.
Thank you. And finally, because he never listened to me when I was his boss, I'll just repeat that, when I was his boss, I'll give the last word to John Reid, but he's going to be bloody quick.
John Reid, Professor of Clinical Psychology, 20 years working with people, we're talking about 20 years researching it. I couldn't figure out, Bob, why you were speaking so fast and trying to get so many studies, and now I understand. How many studies does it take before the accusation of sound bites and cherry picking is just blatantly ridiculous? I don't know what a sound bite sounds like. It sounds like this: depression is a chemical imbalance. That's a sound bite. Literature for eight different strands, all pointing in the same direction, is not a sound bite. It is not cherry picking. And I'd just like to bring 1,829 of Paul's into the room, because we have done the largest study direct to consumers of antidepressants. They answer some of the questions that raised. Joanna said we didn't know how many people experienced withdrawal. In that largest sample, it was 55% of those who had tried to get off, and that was 2/3. 55% had experienced the sort of withdrawal that Paul described. This is a flashback to 30, 40 years ago, isn't it, when the drug companies and psychiatry finally acknowledged that Valium was addictive. Now we're finally getting a true picture. Finally, to come back to what I think is the most important point raised by Baroness Stroud, the biggest danger of all of this is the burial and denial of the true causes of depression and what we need to do about that. Of course, we need to lower prescribing. Of course, we need better education of GPs. But I have declared bias quickly, and I have this simplistic view that I think depression is caused by depressing things happening. I'm sorry.
That's a soundbite.
That is a soundbite. And one last point to confirm the importance of what Baroness Stroud said in terms of our younger people. A meta-analysis, because my area is psychosis actually, a meta-analysis of the causes of psychosis showed that if we could magically get rid of tomorrow, which we can't, all child abuse, child neglect and child poverty, we would eliminate 33% of psychosis.
In the grand tradition of Parliament, we're now three or 4 minutes late, according to my thing. Being a Oxbridge-educated white male heterosexual professor, obviously it falls to me to have the last word on such issues, which embarrasses me. But I've been asked to try to pull some of these things together. I think there is quite a lot of agreement. One of the agreements is that we should listen to people who are the recipients of our services. I think we all agree on that. And I think we would all agree that what comes first is people's rights to equitable treatment, right to have appropriate treatment, right to get information, and right to informed consent. And I think at the moment we're finding that a lot of people are finding their rights are eroded even within the NHS. And for those of us who love the NHS, I think that's worrying. So we all agree on listening to patients, we all agree with protecting their rights, and we have to do more to do that. I think we all agree that we should try to reduce the levels of prescription. I'm not sure that there is anybody, I think you're right, I'm not sure there is any medical professional who thinks that we should increase the use of medication. People do benefit from medication, but many people don't benefit from medication. But I think generally we're aiming to reduce and make more appropriate the prescription rate. So we're not having people, apart from pharmaceutical companies, trying to increase sales. I think we're all agreed that there's no simple picture, and you're absolutely right, behind summary statistics are the variance of human experience, and we need to tease out the individual story. We actually need a scientist to tease out the individual stories amongst the aggregate data, and that's actually quite complicated and difficult, and a difficult piece of work to do. And I think that there are no easy sound bites. I think that's true. I have to say that both talking to members of the public and also talking to the media, we're often under great pressure to produce sound bites. I think it's one of the things that we're asked to do. I think there's some other points that are raised which are possibly not quite so consensual. So there's the issue of agency, and I certainly am one of those people who think that I'm very influenced by Joe's work on the difference between drug-based and disease-based models of psychiatry. And I think the idea of agency and disorder takes us away from the social causation that a lot of people have mentioned, or at least the social context of people's very great difficulties, and the use of medication and the use of diagnosis of disorders in that context. Personally, I think that use of diagnosis and prescription is part of the minimisation of the social context, but also part of the oversimplification of what's a complex issue in each individual's cases. So to say you have post-traumatic stress disorder is a simplification of the life story that people have experienced in order to get there. So that's the point. We all believe in multiple interventions and the idea of multidisciplinary teams and working together, and I think one of the things that comes out of that is the idea of alternatives and then proper rights-based choice for people. But within that, I think there's some worrying questions. So there are worrying issues about rates of disability going up, worrying questions about the rates of prescription going up, and I think, as John Reid said, very worrying data about the possible harms that the medication is doing to people. Where do we go? Well, in my opinion, there's a number of things that people have mentioned, and also actually that people have sent on tweets that I've been seeing. So there's issues to do with randomised controlled trials rather than anecdata on withdrawal. I think Joe has got a randomised control trial running on approaches to withdrawal from psychiatric medication, and running randomised controlled trials that meet scientific criteria on whether or not it's a good idea to come off medication and what's the best way to come off medication. I think those are important. I think that one of the interesting points that's been made to me is the idea of safe havens for people who wish to come off medication, because at the moment people are admitted to hospital when they're ill, they're not given places where they can stay on a residential basis in order to come off medication safely with protocols. There's the issue of protocols to come off medication, which is where NICE and Royal Colleges can come on NICE guidelines on the use of medication, withdrawal from medication, and professional guidelines on withdrawal from medication. There's research on what the drugs actually do, and I think it's very interesting that we don't know what antidepressant or antipsychotic medication does on an emotional, cognitive level. And then finally, I think one of the things that we are all agreed on to a greater or lesser extent is the issue that in order to solve the problems that we're talking about, what we do not need to do is tell poor and disadvantaged people that they've got something wrong with them and they need to take medication to fix it. And I think it is great from a different reason that we're sitting in Parliament, because it's political social change, especially on the issue of social equity, that I think would make protecting people against abuse and ensuring social equity would probably be the most important things we could do to prevent people developing mental health problems. And just one final point before I hand over to Paul, there's also another issue, which is this is not a conflict-free zone. James Davis mentioned the idea that some of the tools that we use in mental health care are powerfully supported by the pharmaceutical industry, and I think it's difficult for all of us to escape from that influence. And even for today, there has, to be honest, been a degree of lobbying about the messages that we put out today. And of course that's valid, because people have points of view that differ. And of course it's important that the science behind the points that we're making are appropriately reflect the nature of the evidence that we have. But I think it is slightly sad that there has been lobbying, even for today, about the relative weight that we give different points of view. And for me, I think it comes back to Baroness Stroud talking about social justice and Paul talking about his experiences, the foci that we need to settle on more than anything else. And on that note, Paul.
If any of us had gone to the best doctor in Vienna in the 19th century and asked him for a cure, he would have given us the drug that he took himself, gave to all his family, all his friends, and all his patients, because he knew it was non-addictive, it was beneficial, and the drug was cocaine. Later came bromide, which produced its own psychosis. Later they came to a variety of lobotomies, leucotomies, deep narcosis therapies, induced comas with insulin, and from then we went to benzos and SSRIs. It's an extraordinary history of error, and a lot of it has been mythology-rich and evidence-free. I remember the war very well. The reason I made the point about the war is that the word depression was never used. It was called that people had bad nerves and things like that. But if we looked at the whole history of what's happened in that case, well, I'm far more worried now about the scream of the silent scream that might come from my 7 grandchildren in the position now and the risk they have of over-medicalisation than I was about my companions in the 30s. It's been a marvellous session we've had here. I think we've all learned a great deal. But it is extraordinary that the mythology that's gone on, that no one has actually taken a sample of brain fluid to count the amount of serotonin in there. I conjecture it wasn't based on any proof at all, that millions of people have been treated on the basis of what is a myth. It's not true, as we've heard this morning. But I think if we can come from here all with just one view, that there have been a century and a half of errors in treating mental illnesses, and we should approach it with humility, the possibility that many of us and many people practicing have been wrong, difficult to come to, and we need to look with evidence, with the proofs that we've heard in such detail this morning, that much of the remedies that have been proposed, much of the public spending that's going on, is not being used sensibly, and that the treatments we give to those who are in torment are ones that are effective. Thanks very much for all those who organised this.